Hello everybody, this is the endocrine section of your packet for the third exam. And sorry, I'm getting situated here. And now, as we look at the endocrine system has to do with communication around the body. But instead of it being based around the nerves, around the brain, it's based off of chemical communication to the cell. And right, so now using my little highlighter here, right, we've been accustomed to describing that the brain is going to be responsible for controlling muscles, right, and capable of sensing things, right, all that, those signals go up to the brain when you touch something, right, on those receptors on your skin, send signals into your brain, and those muscles we learned in lab, like the biceps brachii here, that it's going to move when you command it. So there's a lot of things in the body that actually can move or be commanded by the hormones inside that are controlled and regulated up here in the hypothalamus. But instead of using direct connections with neurons, they use hormones, which are just little chemicals that they place inside of blood vessels so that those little chemicals can be delivered to wherever they need to be delivered in order to elicit some sort of reaction or regulate something in the body. And so they go as hypothalamus is going to be at the very top here, right underneath the thalamus. That's why it's called hypothalamus. And then right below it is the pituitary gland that has a front side and a back side, simply called anterior lobe and posterior lobe. We're going to see that they do something different. And then we also have the pineal gland. This gland is going to be responsible for a lot of regulation in sleep. It's very sensitive to light entering the eyes, and then it kind of makes you sleepy when there's not enough light. Its goal is to keep you safe at night in a way. And then as we make our way downwards, we haven't gone over the respiratory system just quite yet, but this here is your windpipe, more appropriately known as the trachea. And this up here is the larynx, kind of where your Adam's apple is. But we'll talk about that structure a little bit further down. But what we need to know today is that there's this little structure in front of it called thyroid gland. And that's that huge cottage cheese bow tie looking one that you're seeing there. And if we could zoom in and turn this model around, you would see 4 dots as I'm sort of drawing right now. And those 4 dots are called parathyroid glands. We then have sitting on top of the kidneys the adrenal glands, which release things that are what we know as adrenaline. It's sort of very similar type of hormones, and they elicit the fight or flight reaction in the body. It releases epinephrine, is more appropriate what to call it. And then we have our pancreas, which is going to play a role in digestion, as we're going to see later, but its role in endocrine is to release insulin and glucagon. And so those 2 hormones are going to be responsible for regulating things in the body. And the ovaries and testes, lastly, the testes in males, right? This is going to require a lot of communication from the brain. It's going to have to send hormones through the bloodstream in order to cause sperm to produce testes to produce more sperm. And then we're going to have our ovaries as well in females, that the eggs we're going to see later down the line in reproductive, that they are undergoing a maturation process. They're maturing in here a little bit more before they make their way to the outside world. And so we're going to see that that's going to be under the regulation of hormones. And then so for this chapter, make sure we know that females, ovaries is the sex hormone, where the sex cells are produced, and the testes are where the sex cells are produced, sperm. And so a little bit of background on some of those. Thyroid gland is mainly going to be known for being able to control metabolic rate, which means the speed at which you break things down and absorb the nutrients and get rid of waste, and also regulates calcium levels. And remember that calcium is an important part of bones. Bones is the major store for calcium, and those osteoclasts were capable of breaking down calcium in the case we were low. And so thyroid gland plays a role in regulating calcium. The adrenal gland, again, these are going to be the ones that are involved or above the kidneys, and they're going to release something called epinephrine and norepinephrine, and this is what causes that fight or flight reaction. They're also capable of doing some very similar things to the thyroid gland. They can control balance of the ions that are in the body, minerals. They can control metabolic rate again. And also, they help us avoid, or our body to not sort of succumb to stress, like mental stress. Although, yes, we'll leave it at that. And then so here we have our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus is going to be what we consider our master gland in a way, because it is going to be regulating, detecting a lot of things. It's going to be detecting the fluid balance. It's going to detect what hormones are present in the bloodstream. And it's going to, once it detects it, it can regulate them by secreting hormones. And then the last thing it can do is that it can cause smooth muscle to contract. And remember, smooth muscle is going to be present around the body in places where we need some sort of contraction or some motor movement, but, we don't really control it voluntarily. We then have our pituitary gland, and it is going to, let me pick a different highlighter here. It is going to activate the adrenal cortex. We'll talk about what that is in a bit. It's going to activate the thyroid gland, the first gland that we talked about, reproductive organs, and even melanocyte production. So let's talk about these. The adrenal cortex is going to be located in the adrenal glands, a little bit more complicated than we need. So I'm going to say do not need for today. And thyroid gland is going to be important because we just learned that the thyroid gland is responsible for regulating calcium and metabolic rate. And so the pituitary gland can control the thyroid gland. It is sort of the one in charge of the thyroid gland. And then we have our reproductive organs, again, our ovaries in females, and males, the testes. Those are going to be the reproductive organs, and they're capable of stimulating the sex cell production, sperm and eggs. And then they also make your melanocytes. Remember your melanocytes in the skin chapter, the integumentary system? Melanocytes are cells that produce pigment to protect us from harmful UV radiation. And so your pituitary gland stimulates them to actually create melanin. Then our pancreas, every time you consume food, you break down all that food into a sugar, glucose. Remember glucose? We discussed glucose in our carbohydrate chapter. Glucose is a simple sugar. And glucose itself, again, is the source of all, it's like the fuel of the cell. And so when you consume all the foods you are going to consume, they're broken down to, when they're going to be made into energy molecules, they first need to be turned into glucose. And so your pancreas is responsible for ensuring that glucose is taken in by your cells. And it does so through the use of insulin. We then have our pineal gland, and our pineal gland is going to release something called melatonin. Some of you may have gone to stores to buy sleeping pills. This is essentially what it has. I really personally don't believe they work. I hope I'm not ruining that for anybody. But maybe everybody's a little bit different. And so with that, here, this melatonin is what makes us or regulates sleep. And that's what this fancy word is, circadian rhythm. It's talking about what does your body do during the day and what does it do during the night. There's a reason you have more energy in the day, and there's a reason you run out of energy kind of at night. And why light can be disruptive to sleep. And it's because you have structures in the brain, the pineal gland, as we saw for our lab exam, that it's going to be in the brain, but it's going to be sensitive to light. And then lastly, it also affects some reproductive functions, which might be a little beyond, or maybe we'll talk about this when we get to reproductive. So I just need you to know melatonin and circadian rhythms. The parathyroid gland, this is going to regulate calcium. You can see how important calcium is in the body. And so there are other organs that have endocrine functions, meaning that they can release hormones that are going to regulate something. And an example of this right now that's relevant is that the heart is an organ that has an endocrine function that it can regulate the volume in blood. The thymus will elicit or create a strong defense against pathogens, your immune response, the thymus, and that's going to be the structure here, the thymus. Your digestive tract, we'll talk about it when we get there. Kidneys, we'll talk about it when we get there. But the one that matters last is the gonads. And again, this is going to be responsible for ensuring that we get the right hormones for growth during puberty, that we are absorbing our nutrients and releasing waste in a timely and healthy manner. Well, at least one that's conducive to survival. And then lastly, it also develops us during puberty, making us develop from infancy to adults. Next, as we look at the brain, remember that we've learned the thalamus, and now we're here at the hypothalamus. Now, what is the role of this hypothalamus? This hypothalamus is going to be still nervous tissue, neurons and axons, and that's what all these little strings represent. And what I want you to note is that on this diagram, you can see that there are two directions to this. And so this little structure here in the brain is called your pituitary gland. And your pituitary gland is going to be split into two sides. One is going to be the anterior lobe, and the other one's going to be the posterior lobe. So as I said before, there is an adrenal gland here, right? An adrenal gland sits right above the kidneys, but they're showing it here next to the brain, because here you can see that the hypothalamus, all the structure all the way in the brain, is controlling something all the way, right? All the way from up here, all the way down here through the use of just the release of hormones. And, oh, pardon, not this one, pardon. And so this, not releasing through hormones, this one's still doing the traditional connection of neurons and axons. Sorry. I meant to say that the next one on the other side, you're going to see that there's no nerves or axons coming out on this side. And so you can see that this is now going to regulate purely on chemical communicators, hormones. And then on this side, you can see that there's still a lot of nerve tissue. There's the nerve tissues reaching in here. They're connected, a synapse up here connected. And then again, up here, you can see that there is a region that connects all the way to that gland, and it connects to the center of this gland called the adrenal medulla. The word medulla in Latin means middle. And the word cortex means outer area. And so in this case, you can see this is our entire outer area. And then the medulla is inside. And these two areas, even though they're part of the same structure, they actually release different chemicals. So it's worth knowing that very thing. And so you can see that here when we glossed over this one, the hypothalamus secretes hormones involved in fluid balance, with muscle contraction, and finally, secretion by anterior pituitary gland. And this we're going to highlight in yellow. Very important. The hypothalamus has an ability to control a few things, and I think I just accidentally skipped whatever I want to say. No, that's it. Cool. Yes, and you can see that the hypothalamus is directly right above this pituitary gland. And so with that, this connection to this gland is not hormone to hormone. It's still nervous, and so when an action potential or a nerve impulse travels, it'll cause this to release what the adrenal gland is known for secreting. Again, epinephrine and norepinephrine. And normally on day-to-day speech, we usually call this together collectively we call it adrenaline. It's not completely accurate the way I'm describing it, but we've all heard this in movies. Oh, adrenaline. Oh, my adrenaline's running. Really, what's running is your epinephrine and your norepinephrine. This is what gives you those nervous feelings, the butterflies, makes you need to go to the restroom, things like that. And so still, we stay now on the hypothalamus. You can see that there are some connections that are going to go to the posterior pituitary. And then this is going to release only two hormones. We need to know these. Antidiuretic hormone, and don't worry, I have these spelled out on the other page. Antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. That's the only hormones that are released from this segment. Very important. And then this one gets crazy. There's approximately 7 of these hormones that get secreted by the anterior pituitary. And so before we move on to that segment, here's the antidiuretic hormone. And it is released, or what causes it to release that hormone is going to be the supraoptic nuclei. And that's going to be what's connected to it over here, right? This is what they're connected to. Those are nuclei. A bunch of axon bodies are in that area. And so in this instance, you can see that there are regions that release antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin, and they're connected to the hypothalamus, and they travel down, and then they cause the release of norepinephrine, of antidiuretic hormone. And then now the other hormone that's secreted from that same area is the oxytocin hormone. This is what gives that feeling of euphoria, sort of feeling safe and comforted. And typically it's described that women, when they breastfeed, that they get a feeling of like love and wholesomeness, and it's typically attributed to oxytocin. And what's the next thing to add here? Yes, and so these nuclei, supraoptic and paraventricular, are going to be these that you're seeing here illustrated, but do not worry about this. Just need you to know that these are released from the posterior pituitary. Next, we have our hypothalamus, and our hypothalamus is going to be able to regulate a lot of hormones downstream, meaning that it's going to be able to control a lot of the other endocrine organs. There are, and this last note here is there to add that in that hypothalamus, there are some regions that directly connect to the hormone, and so contains autonomic centers, and an autonomic center in the brain is going to be a portion of thing that you don't really consciously control. It's run for you so that you don't have to think about those things as you're running in your day-to-day lives. And this last little note. This is mainly summing up this here, and what this is talking about is your fight or flight. Whenever you hear this word, this is a common way to speak, of that anxiety of either having to defend yourself in a weird way. That's kind of what the word implies, or this expression. But really what we want to say now in anatomy is that your sympathetic system is activated, which means the same thing. And so if we think about what we're talking about here, the adrenal medulla, which is part of the adrenal glands, ones that release adrenaline hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, that they're going to cause you to go into the fight or flight response, or they're going to, your sympathetic system is activated, right? So stimulated in response to sympathetic division activation. And this can be triggered by, again, danger or something that causes some sort of fear of pain in one way or another. With human beings, it's a little odd because a source of pain for human beings is shame. So that's why it's nerves, right? Like if I had made you present in front of the class, your sympathetic is going to be activated because you're nervous. But it's because you're trying to protect yourself, right? You're worried. Yeah, just keep it there. Getting a little too behavioral psychology and philosophical there. All right. So now here, hypothalamus, right? This is where we're at, the hypothalamus. And I know this looks crazy, but this is kind of where it ends. There's really nothing else, just to add a little bit of a vocab. And as we're still looking at our pituitary gland, you can see here's the hypothalamus. What we've done so far is that we've looked at the posterior pituitary. We saw that it's going to have some sensory cells, so connected, not really hormones, and they're going to release ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. And something that antidiuretic hormone does is that it helps regulate liquid volume. Maybe it's redundant to write that, but liquid volume in body. And oxytocin, it's going to be involved in, you can see where it's going here. It's going to males, the smooth muscles, the male orgasm is actually the feeling, the enjoyment of it comes from this hormone, oxytocin. And again, oxytocin causes sort of feelings of love and safety and things like that. And so oxytocin in males typically is only really found in when they're doing sources of pleasure in reproductive and possibly activity levels. That one I'm not quite sure on, to be sincerely honest. If activity levels cause oxytocin release, I feel like it doesn't, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't. So oxytocin, again, I'm going to put male orgasm. And then for the females, oxytocin does a few things. You know, when a child finally exits the uterus during birth, it actually causes the pain to kind of go away. It makes it, releases this hormone to sort of provide it as sort of a painkiller in a way. And maybe this is not universal for every woman, but a lot of women have report in our medical sciences or surveys that the second that an infant is born, that there is the pain of labor kind of just goes away, just instantly just goes away. Born, oh dang it, I forgot what I was writing, so sometimes I can't write and talk. And causes euphoria in infant care, and I think that that's perfect for us as a class, because this could be a few ways. And again, females, they also experience the release of this hormone when they breastfeed as well. So you can see that. That's why I kind of like this expression, cause euphoria in infant care. It really causes, the desire to care for the infant. And that's a pretty cool fact to know. And then another one that's pretty easy for us to know is that if this, actually, this one might be a one that's stimulated differently. Do I want to get that crazy on all of you? No, I will not. And so the only few ones I want you to know are going to be these. I want you to know that the pituitary gland, right, they're all in this pituitary gland. These are all the regulatory hormones. You can see there's quite a bit, and they're quite terrible to say. But we need to know some of them, and so I'm going to pick the easy ones, okay? So we're going to do growth hormone releasing, right? Growth hormone releasing hormones, telling you what it does. It releases growth hormone. If we follow it downstream, you can see here, growth hormone. So this hormone causes the release of this hormone, and then it causes the liver to release somatomedins, which then stimulate the muscle and bones to grow. All right, so that's a pretty good, unique one, a cool one for us, because we've gone over bones and we've gone over muscles, and this is what causes them to grow over time, is this particular hormone. So it's a good fact to know. What's another? We're going to do the reproductive one, and we'll leave it there at that, because that's going to come up later, and it's a nice introduction to the material. If you look at this segment, FSH and LH, these two are going to go to both the testes and ovaries. These are shared. Both man and female release these, and they release it as a result of this one. The gonadotropin hormone releases FSH and LH in both males and females. And this will cause a few things to go downstream, but don't worry about these yet. Don't worry, when I get to reproductive, I'll traumatize you with these. But otherwise, you just need to know FSH and LH are released as a result of the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone. We're going to do the last one in reproductive here. Prolactin releasing and prolactin inhibiting. Right, this means releasing, this means stopping. And so if it releases it, you can see it's going, and then it's going to release prolactin. That's what this PRL means. And by the way, this key is right here for you. I don't know if you noticed it. All these abbreviations here can be found on this key. And so this, where was I? Here, this PRL is our prolactin. And so prolactin is going to induce the production of milk in the breast. Pretty cool, right? And so you can see how the endocrine plays a big role in controlling a few things in the body. So let's finish highlighting this, and this one, and this, and this, and this. And we will leave it at that, okay? I won't ask you about the other ones. Even though this one we probably guessed, right? MSH releases melanocyte stimulating hormone. It stimulates the melanocytes to release melanin. All right, but you don't have to know this one. This is sort of under an odd indirect control of the sun, but don't worry about that. And then to finish up, forms of communication. This table has everything you need. This is a nice little read, a little summary of what we talked about. And make sure to read through it, but what really interests me is this table. This table, here you can see that cells can communicate in a few manners. They can do direct communication. One will find it, communicate with it. White blood cells are very known for this. And actually this is a different situation if we're using gap junctions. And then so this is now, if cells are adjacent to each other, they can communicate through gap junctions. Pardon, I'm thinking about someone else. And then so this is, they're just directly connected, sharing a plasma membrane, and again, through the gap junctions. Paracrine communication now, this is when they release things into the ECM, or the extracellular fluid, and then those hormones go and find cells. Right? When they find the cells, then they elicit these cells to do something that's considered paracrine secretion. And typically they're going to be pretty close to each other. Para means to be next to. And so when they release substances, they release it next to them and then stimulate them to do something. And so they do it through the extracellular fluid. We call hormones that communicate in this manner by next door communication with chemicals paracrine. And then we have our autocrine. These is self-regulating, right? They self-auto. And so these release hormones and it affects them themselves, which is pretty unique about these. And so these, again, are communicating through the fluid around the outside. And they are called autocrines because they are capable of communicating and stimulating themselves in that way. And then lastly, we have endocrine communication. This is something that we've talked about before. Endocrine will always refer when they're released, not next to each other, like in the previous example, but instead they are released into the blood vessels, and then the blood vessels sends them down wherever they need to go. And that's really why you can see that the whole system is named after this mechanism of placing things in the blood vessel, endocrine communication. And the signals are hormones, right? And then so this really becomes a table of how cells communicate. And you can see endocrine is how cells communicate with each other. And one that we briefly touched on is synaptic communication, that when we talk about our neuromuscular junction, remember our muscle cell, that they release neurotransmitters, acetylcholine, and that acetylcholine will go and bind to these acetylcholine receptors, and then it'll stimulate the cell downstream, but that's going to be a synaptic communication, right? Not endocrine. Synaptic, because it's releasing neurotransmitters in this open little space. And we call all endocrine hormones that are secreted by this method by neurons at the ends of neurons in cells, we call them neurotransmitters when the axons are releasing it. And so we're going to see this one again, and that's why we're introducing it today, is that this is going to be how all neurons communicate when they reach another cell. And they release substances, and it's the same concept as hormones, but if it's a hormone released by the nervous tissue, it's considered a neurotransmitter. That's the only difference. With that, that sums up our endocrine section.